if it isn't my fellow gaming enthusiasts. How kind of you to drop in on my humble YouTube channel. Unfortunately, you've fallen right into my trap. Do you want to play a game? Well, a game implies that there is a way to lose, and losing is impossible without an outstanding adversary in your way. Last time, we celebrated the heroes, but this episode honors the dishonorable, the villains who oppose them. The rules are ever so simple, but evil comes in such a variety of flavors, how could I possibly choose? While overlooking my collection of ludonarrative luxuries, I came up with a few criteria by which to judge these vile fiends. Number 1. Are they interesting, morally or otherwise? They can be mustache-twirling baddies if they are so inclined, but if so, I need them to be entertaining. If they don't have some deep and sympathetic reasons, they can at least be deliciously evil. Number 2. How evil are they? This includes how successful their malicious schemes are. Whether they're robbing banks or destroying planets, do they pose an actual threat to the established stakes of the story? And number 3, most subjectively, how much is the player motivated to stop them? They should keep you wanting to play the game just to put them out of business. Or alternatively, they could create a situation so philosophically complicated that you start to buy into their motives and beliefs, leading to all sorts of juicy drama. There's more than one way to skin, extort, or murder a cat. But, you've caught me monologuing, you sly dogs. Let's get to the fun. This is my top 10 video game villains! Would you believe me if I told you that this was harder to narrow down compared to Heroes? A lot of great villains got left out, especially some recurring classics. Even Bowser didn't quite make the cut. I guess I wanted to take a more serious approach to my villains this time around. I cut out most of the baddies who are just evil for evil's sake, but I did save room for one mustache-twirling doctor. No, not that one. Not that one. Not even that one. It's the one, the only, Dr. Nefarious. And he doesn't even have a mustache. Most followers of the Ratchet & Clank series would agree that Nefarious is the main recurring villain, and while he certainly has the most repeat appearances, believe it or not, he actually didn't get his start until the third Ratchet game, drastically changing the series' trajectory. The first two games introduce an overly consumerist galactic society where every planet is a tourist attraction, and every gun is as seen on TV. Councilman Drek is a maniacal land baron whose villainy is empowered by this money-obsessed society, whereas Abercrombie Fizzwidget, who turns out to be Captain Quark in disguise, proves how heroes become products to make their corporations richer. It's all very cynical. But in Ratchet 3, we get Dr. Nefarious, with his bombastic plan to turn all bioorganic life in the galaxy into robots. There's some throwaway lines that Nefarious is fighting for the oppressed robot kind, but it's more of an incredibly flimsy justification for his villainy, both in and out of universe.
Soon, all robots will bask in the liberty and equality of my benevolent, iron-fisted rule.
Nowhere else are robots referred to as a slave class or put down any more than anyone else in this rather mean-spirited society. In fact, Nefarious was a squishy organic being himself until Quark bullied him so bad he fully roboticized himself. And by his next appearance, he's instead trying to rewrite history so that the bad guys always win. Literally, his words, not mine.
Every villain who has ever stumbled will get a do-over. Every protagonist's triumph will be reversed, until finally, a new present is created, in which the heroes always lose!
So it's safe to say that any moral issue he brings up is just an excuse for him to do more villainy. I mean, his name is Dr. Nefarious. They weren't going for nuance here. Nefarious is a scene-stealing and chewing cartoon supervillain whose melodramatic gestures are matched only by his astronomical ego. Every moment he's on screen, he's screaming, and I mean screaming, at his robot butler Lawrence, whose limited range of emotion makes him the perfect straight man and whose assistance is often necessary when Dr. Nefarious gets too heated, which is basically all the time. See, a defect in his roboticized brain is that if he gets too upset, he'll freeze up and a rerun of a schlocky space soap opera will emerge from his gaping slack jaw, requiring a hard reboot.
I don't have the capacity for love, Janice. I was cursed by a tribe of gypsy ninjas when I was a kid.
I know, Lance. I was in that tribe of gypsy ninjas.
It's very silly, stupid even, but he's everything I want in a dumb recurring villain. He has trouble telling fact from fiction, first thinking that Clank's on-screen secret agent character was a real hero who might join the robot uprising. He takes attempts at stopping his world domination as a personal slight, he forms crackpot plans around baseless assumptions, at times he joins the heroes when a more serious threat arrives, and his villain mission statement eventually devolves into the vague notion of just winning against the heroes, such as his aforementioned villains always win timeline that he tries to create in A Crack in Time. Or in A Rift Apart where he invents the Dimensionator to find a reality where he's already won. What makes me rank Nefarious higher than the other such stupid evil baddies is how dangerous he actually is. Eggman and Bowser have their moments, sure, but Nefarious has the better ratio of appearances where he's actually a threat. The weapons he develops are devastatingly powerful, and he's possibly scarier when he's not taking a situation seriously. His violent mood swings often trigger his weapons, making him chaotic and unpredictable. And if you prefer a more lawful evil villain, Rift Apart shows us an alternate version of him, Emperor Nefarious, who got his act together and conquered the universe. And you know what? He's still pretty silly. Unlike other villains who are jokes in most appearances and competent threats to the world and others, Nefarious is always both. He is an incompetent threat. And that's what makes the joke funny. He really might win this time, if completely by accident. And at the end of the day, he's just fun to watch.
Oh, Janice, you'll always be the love of my life.
You really should have that looked at.
As if I haven't talked about Fire Emblem enough already. Seriously, this is becoming the new League. Fire Emblem is a series that loves its archetypes. You've got your red and green knights, your early game paladins, your dragon people, but if there's one archetype that's everyone's favorite, well, actually, it's the waifus. We all love our pretty emblem girls. But in terms of villainy, a popular recurring archetype is the Mad King. Many games in the series feature a man in a position of power who has gone utterly insane and now wants to conquer and/or burn all of civilization. By the 3DS games, the writers began to play with these tropes. Maybe the Mad King was in opposition to the real main threat, or maybe it was the main character's father. But Three Houses threw the best curveball with this trope by making the Mad King one of the waifus. Edelgard von Hresvelg, head of the Black Eagles, ruler of the Adrestian Empire, and a divisive subject in Fire Emblem discourse, which I think makes her all the more fascinating as a villain. And make no mistake, she is a villain. Crimson Flower is a villain route, and the other three routes set her as the main antagonist for most of the story. As I've said in the past, the strength of Three Houses' split storyline is the attachment you get to your chosen students. Whether you choose to teach the dutiful Blue Lions or the pack of misfits that make up the Golden Deer, the colorful personalities should endear you enough to make you want to stick with them until the end. But if you choose the Black Eagles, there's still a chance Edelgard leaves your side. I guess because agreeing to tutor her in math isn't exactly the same as agreeing to commit a genocide, the game wanted to give you an out. As soon as Edelgard reveals her intentions, she takes complete control of the plot. This can be tough for a lot of players who grew close to her, maybe even wishing to romance her. And if you still see the good in her, you may be tempted to join in her crusade, and in doing so you can at least curb her rage, making the resulting dictatorship a little less tyrannical. In Edelgard's defense, though, her rage isn't unjustified. Fodlan as a continent is shaped by the existence of crests, special attributes in royal bloodlines that literally make royals more powerful than commoners. As a child, Edelgard was experimented on by those who slither in the dark. I always hated that name. You know, I'm just gonna call them the Agarthans. The Agarthans tortured Edelgard to improve her crest as part of their research to defeat the Church of Seiros. So as an adult poised to take the throne of her country, Edelgard wants to reform this whole crest system. Fair enough, we see all over the place how unfair this system of eugenic rulership is, and only extreme measures could hope to change things. But she takes some extreme measures! Edelgard even aligns herself for a time with the Agarthans, the people who tortured her to destroy the Church of Seiros. And yeah, Rhea, the church's leader, is no angel either. She's largely responsible for perpetuating Crest rulership, and do not get me started on what she did to Byleth and Geralt. But the Agarthans are out here destroying villages and torturing children. They should be your first target. Edelgard will get around to destroying them eventually, but bottom line, she plans to burn it all. She's willing to transform and mutilate herself into monstrous forms to win a fight, and has no problem using her cities as staging grounds for large battles, because in her own words, every Adrestian will gladly lay down their life for this cause. Yeah, that's real nice of her to decide that for them. The sad thing is, Edelgard has a lot in common with Rhea, the subject of her hatred. The major difference is that Rhea has had centuries to reflect on her actions, being a goddess dragon person, again, archetypes, whereas Edelgard is unwilling or unable to examine her own actions, and as such, stands at best to replace fascism with more and different fascism. I know you Edelgard stands out there don't like me using that word. I know it's a medieval setting and our standards of government are different, but even with that context, it's rather telling just how far Edelgard will go to accomplish her goals. And that brings me to 3 hopes, which adds even more spice to this already seething Empress. I'm not going to go into too much detail, as this game is still fairly new and I want to avoid spoilers. But the alternate scenario that can unfold makes for situations that truly demonstrate how much of a shrewd, intelligent, ruthless, and downright devious leader Edelgard can be. Adding to this are moments of vulnerability that show just how much guilt she harbors for going down the path she set out for herself, while maintaining the willpower and ambition to keep moving forward. You can still like her, in fact she's my favorite of this game's lords. Those brief moments when she's able to let her guard down around you are heart-melting. But it does not change the fact. Edelgard is an unfitting, albeit tragic leader, which makes for a very fitting and tragic villain. One so compelling that even whole sections of the player base will join her cause. I left out a lot of famous recurring villains, but dude, Ridley hits different. So let's talk about the Nemesis, the villain that is inexorably tied to their hero, as if they exist only to ruin their life. We spent some time in the last video hyping up Samus Aran, my favorite heroine in video games, depending on which gender of Commander Shepard you play, and being the sworn enemy of such a badass bounty hunter is one hell of an endorsement. Let's start with that kick-ass design. It's believed Metroid creator Yoshio Sakamoto named Ridley after Ridley Scott, the guy who made the Alien movies. Ridley himself bears many similarities to that ever-famous movie monster, the Xenomorph, with his long bony frame and razor-sharp tail, just also a dragon. Like the Xenomorph, Ridley is more intelligent than you'd expect from such a monstrous entity, and he's more than a little sadistic. In Metroid and Super Metroid, he's just another general of Mother Brain, with the added honor of being the one to steal the baby Metroid from captivity in Super Metroid's famous opening. What really cemented Ridley as the stuff of Samus's nightmares, though, is from the official manga, which was supervised by Sakamoto to coincide with the release of Metroid Zero Mission. Here we learn that Ridley is the one who led the space pirate raid on Samus's home when she was just a little girl, killing her parents and leaving her alive just for funsies. In that moment was born an eternal hatred between the two that not even death could sever. In my top 10 video game dragons, I chose Ridley for the number 2 spot for his ability to terrorize Samus on a deeply personal level, and his fitting not only the physical definition of a dragon, but also the narrative. In trope terminology, the dragon is a powerful secondary villain working for the main boss. The best dragons serve as both a worthy opponent for the hero in combat, and an emotional score the hero must settle before confronting the final evil. In each game, Ridley either serves as the main villain's right-hand dragon man, or shows up whenever it would be least convenient, and he's generally the best part of the game. The dude simply won't stay dead, in part due to his species' hyper-regenerative qualities, which are enhanced by a healthy diet of dead parents, and in part because he's such an incredible specimen that the space pirates will devote most of their technology budget to reviving him. Even the Galactic Federation wanted a Ridley clone, resulting in the parasitic copy Infusion and this weirdly sinister baby in Other M. I'll give Other M props for this at least. Even before you know this thing is Ridley, the sense of unease you get whenever it's around is oddly affecting. The way it looks at Samus like it somehow knows she killed him in another life. Ugh. What really sells it for me is how incredibly un-Nintendo this guy is. Maybe it wasn't his size that kept him out of Smash for so long, because when he finally did join the roster, he immediately kills Mario. And look at that smile, you know he enjoyed it. And I'm really glad they implemented his famous grab move where he drags Samus across a wall or floor like a sham wow. It's these personal touches to Ridley's fighting style that really make him more than an incredibly awesome monster design. He's a beast with an ever-growing arsenal and an adaptive strategic mind that can match Samus wit for wit. Without Ridley, there would be no Samus. Her hero's journey is shaped around her disdain for this murderous pterodactyl. So for that, I guess I have Ridley to thank for one of my favorite series. Silver lining, I guess. It shows that Ridley was inspired by a horror franchise. He's about as scary as you can make a video game villain without it actually being a horror game. At least, that's how I felt whenever playing Metroid as a kid. Nowadays, that feeling has shifted to the SAX and Emmy, but that's a topic for another day. But there was another villain that struck even greater fear in my young gamer heart back in the day, and he goes by the name of Clockwork. Yeah, sorry about that fake out in the last list, Cooper fans, but this time I'm throwing you a bone. Clockwork, despite how little dialogue he has, despite how little he's on screen, is one of the most surprisingly effective villains for anyone who thought this mascot platformer would be nothing but laughs. In a world of anthropomorphic animals where the Cooper clan have reigned supreme as the master thieves, only one entity has ever posed them a challenge: a jealous owl who covets the infamy of being history's greatest thief. So great is his envy, he's able to live off of pure hatred for thousands of years. He's waited in the shadows since antiquity, and even when his body gave out, he fully converted his body into machinery, powered by the hate chip, a literal battery of malice, until the day he can murder the Coopers and steal their precious book of secrets, the Thievius Raccoonus. I don't know why he waited until then, and honestly, I don't care. I love how committed he was to hold a grudge for so long. First, let me say this. Owls? Top tier animal. They're by far the most versatile birds of prey thanks to their high-range night vision, their ability to triangulate noise, and their completely silent flight. In classical civilization, we often equate owls to wisdom, but they can throw down hard if they want to. In fact, many Mesoamerican cultures see the owl as a bad omen or even a symbol of death, which feels very fitting for Clockwork, who spends much of the first game as a sinister silhouette in the distance. Also, while raccoons and foxes compete for resources in many ecosystems, owls are able to hunt both of them. This gives Sly, Carmelita, and Clockwork an adversarial relationship based on their designs alone, with Clockwork as the apex predator. Nice touch! Now keep in mind that Clockwork is not a complex villain. In fact, he's the simplest on this list. but he's simple in a way that is executed to perfection. The build up to him is unreal in the first game. This guy's been on Sly's mind his entire life. He's the reason Sly had to grow up in an orphanage, and why he couldn't depend on his family's secrets when he started his own career of capers. This might just be me, but by the time I defeated all of his former subordinates and climbed all the way up to his perilous volcanic hideout, I was having serious anxiety over actually fighting this guy. How old was I when this game came out? 11? Well, I always felt like a toddler when I first played it because that's how Clockwork made me feel, like a helpless little kid. You're just a plucky burglar with a wacky stick. He's a giant cybernetic raptor of death. And it doesn't help that you fight him on his turf using the jetpack, a clunky gameplay style that was only just introduced for this final fight. He's got the home field advantage and Sly just has to improvise. Clockwork meets his demise after no doubt several attempts from the player, but remarkably, it's not the last Sly would hear that catchy name. The plot of Sly 2 revolves entirely around a new group of villains gathering up the fearsome fowl's scrapped remains. Clockwork has so much narrative weight to him that just the idea of his feathers falling into the wrong hands is cause for immediate action. Even in death, Clockwork's hatred plagues the Cooper air and turns small rollers like Jean Bisson into serious threats. There is some mixed feelings from fans over how Clockwork immediately hijacks the climax from Neela, who just minutes before hijacked the climax from Arpeggio. Personally, I would have loved them each to get a proper boss fight before bringing back the big bad bird, but it goes to show just how out of their depth they are around the Owl OG. He's not even sentient anymore, but his pure hatred is enough to swallow Neela's will. And even after his second and final defeat, he deals one last blow, permanently paralyzing one of Sly's closest friends in a moment so traumatic it breaks up the Cooper gang. Like, yeah, Clockwork, you did exactly what you set out to do. You destroyed the Cooper legacy, physically and psychologically. For a while at least. The gang eventually recovers, which is more than we can say for Clockwork, but even with a destroyed hate chip, I can't help but feel he could return at any time. Fortunately, they never brought him back, so Sly can finally rest easy. Oh, fuck. I want to circle back to the Edelgard being a villain bit for a second, because there's a lot of games that let you take that evil path. In fact, there's quite a few games centered around the premise that you, my dear player, are the real villain here. Either it's established right out of the gate, like Destroy All Humans or Overlord, or it's the big twist at the end, like in... well, why spoil a bunch of games that I'm not even going to talk about? The one I will talk about, though, is maybe the most famous for, what the hell, player? Spec Ops: The Line. It's for this brutal twist that a seemingly unremarkable military shooter is such a popular talking point in my corner of the internet. And while the attention is more than warranted, I also think the common knowledge of this game's famous trick has caused us to forget just how smart this game actually is, and how well it turns the protagonist Martin Walker into a despicable monster. Captain of the United States Army's Delta Force, Walker and his squad mates are tasked to investigate the city of Dubai in the midst of a massive sandstorm, confirm if there are any survivors, and report back their findings for possible evacuation. That's it, nothing else. And boy do things not go as planned. The government of Dubai has already fled the city, the sandstorm is blocking out all communication, and the remaining civilian population has been left under the care of Colonel John Conrad and the 33rd Division, who seem to have taken over the city in this chaotic situation. Walker confirms that there are survivors pretty quickly, but when the armed residents open fire, Walker and his men fire back and kill them. Whoops. But, you know, it was either us or them. Walker didn't really have a choice. As he gets further in, American troops start attacking Walker, so Walker's forced to shoot them too. Whoops! But again, no choice. Conrad's not messing around, so when Walker finally finds Conrad's base packed with soldiers, Walker's forced to complete the mission with the use of white phosphorus. And for those of you who don't know, white phosphorus is an extremely controversial weapon in real life, causing such excruciating pain it's considered inhumane even in times of war. But this isn't just war, says Walker. This is to save lives. so he deploys the white phosphorus into what turns out to be a civilian camp, where all innocent bystanders were hiding from Walker. Whoops! By this point, Walker's receiving radio messages from Conrad taunting him, reprimanding him for the controversy he just committed, telling him to go home. But like a sick sunk cost fallacy, Walker vows he can't leave these people in Conrad's hands. He's gonna be the Dubai hero, even if it kills everyone. And thus begins a descent into madness with an ever-growing casualty rate. It's worth noting that Walker is already an experienced veteran when he enters Dubai. He has had his fair share of PTSD. But it's not the trauma that causes these poor choices. It's something on a whole different level. The writer of Spec Ops: The Line, Walt Williams, based Walker's journey on two major works of fiction. The first is Heart of Darkness, a novel about a man who loses his humanity while hunting down an ex-soldier in the Congo. The second is Apocalypse Now, a film that adapts Heart of Darkness, setting it instead in the Vietnam War. The setting, the context, hell, even the medium are different, but all three of these works have a nearly identical story. An adversary taking over the local population and our quote-unquote hero striving to liberate them, finding his inner darkness when he's so far removed from what he considers civilization. But Spec Ops: The Line has a few new tricks. One is Walker's squad mates. Lugo is a less experienced and innocent man who masks his fear with jokes. He dies. And Adams is a hardened veteran who's learned to control his emotions in the heat of the mission. He also dies. As they die, so too does Walker's own sense of innocence and his own sense of control. Even the loading screens go from press A to shoot to monsters don't get to go home. Until the final nail in the coffin. Walker finally confronts Conrad only to find that he's dead. Whoops! Yeah, he's been dead the whole time. He was just one of Walker's increasingly vivid hallucinations. So, unlike Heart of Darkness or Apocalypse Now, where the enemy represents the protagonist's inner evil, in this case, Conrad is Walker's inner evil. He's the fake threat Walker used to justify his continued involvement. You can even see Walker moving his mouth sometimes when Conrad is talking. And you can't say that he was just following orders, because remember what his mission was?
We have our orders. Locate survivors, leave the city immediately. Radio command from outside the storm wall. Send in the cavalry, and go home.
This was supposed to be nothing more than a recon mission. The plan was to call for backup to carry out the evacuation. This was not Walker's job. But out of some need to be important, some need to matter, some need to be a hero, Walker continued to push through no matter how many times he made things worse. All he needed to do was stop. All you, the player, needed to do was stop. And this is where I think the game's reputation has muddled the actual message of the game. Critics might say it's a cheap trick to blame the player for these atrocities. It's not like Undertale or Mass Effect where you can strive to make better choices. And what, the company's gonna sell us a $50 game and then chastise us for playing it? No. I don't think Williams wants to reprimand the player for finishing story mode. The point isn't to shame you. But in a time when military shooters were all the rage and games were glorifying 360 no-scopes, Williams is simply asking that we be more thoughtful about our media, that we consider the ramifications of shooting every NPC we see, and interacting with a world strictly through violence. He's saying that the genre can do better than macho wish fulfillment, better than glorifying the horrors that break so many men and women in service. That games need to do better. Spec Ops: The Line shows Walker crossing that line, getting swept away with the mission and losing himself in the process, his executions becoming more and more brutal as the game progresses, with Nolan North giving the voice performance of his life.
Everything. All this. It was your fault. That's what you believe, then shoot me. 2. I didn't mean to hurt anybody. No one ever does, Walker.
Walker didn't think he had a choice either. He thought he was the hero that Dubai needed. But it goes to show that for the most part, every villain is the hero of their own story.
This is Captain Martin Walker, requesting immediate evacuation of Dubai. Survivors. One too many.
Pokemon is another series that lives and dies by its archetypes. Every mainline game has its 3 starters, its professor, its villain team, and of course, its villainous team leader. I gave the OG Giovanni ample praise in my top 10 crime lords, and I stand by everything I said there, but stacking him against all the villains in all video games is a little tough, given the bare-bones plot of Pokemon Red and Blue. And this is the thought I've been having a lot lately in current Pokemon discourse. Fans pick apart Sun and Moon and Sword and Shield, citing underdeveloped characters and plot threads, but from where I'm standing, none of the mainline Pokemon games have had what I would call a great story. Or at least a deep and compelling one anyway. So props to Generation 5, which I think came the closest, actually attempting to have themes and subtext, as well as featuring Ghetsis, the biggest bastard in Pokemon history. Since the beginning, a simple question has plagued the Pokemon series. Isn't it kinda messed up to catch these little creatures and make them fight each other? And while there's always been hand-wavy answers that the Pokemon want to fight and get stronger, or that they learn to love you as soon as they're caught, which is somehow even more horrific, Pokemon Black and White decided to tackle this argument head-on, by having Ghetsis make that argument and then revealing him to be the least redeemable character in the series. Ghetsis doesn't even believe in his own rhetoric. He loves using Pokemon for power. But by appealing to a seemingly sensible outlook, Ghetsis creates Team Plasma and comes dangerously close to his goals. Let's lay out his big plan, because by Pokemon standards, it's incredibly devious. Step 1. Ghetsis adopts an orphan. N, which is short for natural, is a sensitive boy who, due to growing up in the woods, can speak with Pokemon but is socially awkward around people. This makes him the perfect ward for Ghetsis to completely indoctrinate, as he will take everything at face value and feels obliged to follow Ghetsis' orders. Additionally, Ghetsis surrounds N with only abused Pokemon, so that N will only be exposed to the worst case scenarios and think that they are the norm. Step 2. Ghetsis creates Team Plasma, a cult dedicated to emancipating Pokemon. He positions his starry-eyed puppet as the king, and touts him as the chosen one who will command a legendary dragon and free the land. Given his disposition, even N believes this prophecy and grows into a talented, though unorthodox Pokemon battler. In a way, Ghetsis is training N the same way he'd train a Lillipup. Step 3. Team Plasma wins over the masses with anti-trainer propaganda that, again, Ghetsis himself doesn't believe in. With its seemingly noble goals, Team Plasma sways a wealth of people to join its ranks, from well-meaning and sympathetic people like we see in Black and White 2, to complete psychopaths who revel in the chance to wear armor and enact Ghetsis' seedier goals. Step 4. N is instructed to befriend, not catch, a plethora of Pokemon and challenge the Unova champion. With Alder defeated and N the new champion, he now has the sway to convince everyone to release their Pokemon. And step 5, Ghetsis does not release his Pokemon. If all goes as planned, he'll be the only one left with a monster menagerie and can then rule the country unopposed. I don't think the game's script takes full advantage of how interesting this plot is for a Pokemon villain. But there's plenty of details about Ghetsis that show how brilliant and downright evil he is. He's a terrible father for one thing, immediately berating N for giving you a fair fight. And though N is only his foster son? Okay, come on, look at the mint green hair. I'm pretty sure that's your own kid and you're just fostering him so that he feels like he owes you more. But apparently according to Pokemon Evolutions, they more or less confirmed that N was just a kid they found. I still think that's kind of boofant shit, but okay. Either way, there's evidence to support Ghetsis was planning to backstab N the moment his plan was complete. His ace Pokemon, Hydreigon, is basically designed to sweep N's team with a super effective move for each of them. And I know I'm getting ahead of myself here, but in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, we meet an alternate universe version of Ghetsis who was successful in his plan, and what's that on his team? the legendary dragon type N was using. How did you get that, Getsis? Where's your son? And let's talk about that Hydreigon for a moment. It's a dark dragon type, which is pretty much the most evil combination I can think of. And in Black 2 and White 2, Getsis' Hydreigon uses a move called Frustration, which gets more powerful the less it likes its trainer. Hydreigon is the only enemy Pokemon in any of the games to use it at its full power. So, in layman's terms, he hates Getsis. No doubt Getsis mistreats his own Pokemon, which might explain why Hydreigon is below level 64, which is the level Zweilous needs to be at to evolve. Did Hydreigon evolve in a fury to break free of Getsis' control? Is that why Getsis is missing an eye and has a damaged arm? Maybe some experimental technology was involved. Getsis has a plethora of world-breaking science at his disposal, thanks to the recruitment of the morally pliable Colress. Getsis' staff emits a signal that can prevent Pokeballs from working. He has a subterranean castle that emerged around the Elite Four building. Oh, and if you talk to some of the scientists in the castle, they say they've cracked the code on how to steal Pokemon from trainers' PC boxes. Meaning anyone who isn't convinced by N to release their Pokemon, Getsis will just take them anyway. That is terrifying! So while he's ultimately revealed for the despotic sociopath he is, that just freed Getsis to come back louder and prouder in Black 2 and White 2. Take for example this Freeze Ray powered by the legendary Kyurem, which he uses to encase Opelucid City in ice. Are you gonna look at this and tell me no one in town died? Getsis has a kill count, which he attempts to raise by commanding Kyurem to use Glaciate on you. There's quite a few child murderers on this list, but my god, this is a Pokemon game! Using the DNA Splicer to absorb N's dragon into Kyurem, Getsis becomes the only Pokemon villain to use 7 Pokemon against you, outside of XD and Legends Arceus anyway, the only villain to command a legendary, and the only villain to steal the spotlight from the champion as the last boss before the credits. And again, the only villain in the series to attempt to forego the Pokemon battle and just kill a child, which he attempts twice. Is he a crazed madman, or is he just more willing to exploit the bizarre world of Pokemon? Honestly, probably a little bit of both. Or a lot of both. We've talked about joke villains, nemesis villains, friends turned villains, and even the player turned villain. But what we haven't hit yet are the masterminds, the one who was pulling the strings all along. Well, I guess Clockwork and Getsis both qualify, but neither of them are surprises to the player. Some of my favorite masterminds show up in mystery or conspiracy stories. Someone murdered these people in Inaba. Someone set up the Nonary games. Someone is controlling this stupid bear. You just can't put a face to the culprit until the big reveal. Or other times, in a big sprawling narrative, the mastermind is still in the process of taking over, playing everyone like an orchestra of fiddles. It's not until they reveal themselves as the main antagonist that you'll really understand what they even wanted, and if done well, it will allow you to look back on their actions in a new light. The longer the con, the more glorious the victory. But also the harder it is to believe that they, or even the writers, really planned all this. For example, number 4 had to wait 50 in-game years and 10 real-world years for his plan to come to fruition. So allow me to present this to you in the way I experienced it as a Metal Gear fan. This is the story of Revolver Ocelot. The name is pretty stupid honestly, which is probably the first impression you were supposed to get. We know Revolver Ocelot is a villain from the get-go, but what kind of villain seems to change with each appearance, as does the scope of his machinations. Firstly, he's just one of the animal-themed cronies working for Liquid Snake. Then it turns out he's an informant for an even bigger villain, Solidus Snake. Keep up, this will be on the test later. Then he swaggers into Metal Gear Solid 2 like he owns the place, revealing his marksmanship is much better than we realize, and he was probably holding back in that first fight. He's a total badass. Or is he? Because shortly after, he's being controlled by Liquid Snake's arm, which he grafted into his body to replace his own arm, so now he's a host for Liquid? Okay, wow, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And in the prequel, Metal Gear Solid 3, we learned that Ocelot's actually been a major player in these events longer than we realized. So he's Big Boss's rival, but maybe a friend, but maybe a triple agent? Then, in Metal Gear Solid 4, Ocelot enacts his endgame, taking control of the world's war economy and declaring himself the ultimate ruler of the planet. And thank God the evil arm thing was a lie, so Snake would think he was crazy. Well played, Ocelot. Except, no. Actually, everything that's happened through the Metal Gear series, it turns out, was part of Ocelot's plan to rid the world of an even worse threat. So he's actually a heroic villain?
What?
Okay, so here's what's really going on here. During the Cold War, a young Ocelot meets Snake's dad, Big Boss, and though they're on opposite sides, they find that they have similar goals and eventually form a camaraderie. Metal Gear Solid 3 ends with the defeat of this woman, the Boss, who was forced to play the villain and martyr herself to prevent nuclear Armageddon. And yeah, I know this is confusing, but the Boss and Big Boss are two different people. The Boss's death inspired two of her peers, Big Boss and Colonel Zero, to form a group in hopes of creating the world the Boss wanted, a coalition called the Patriots, which secretly controlled the path of history for the next half-century. Eventually, Big Boss and Zero had a falling out, Big Boss believing that Orwellian surveillance isn't really what his old teacher wanted, and without Big Boss on the project, the Patriots went off the rails. By Metal Gear Solid 4, the group is actually just a computer program, soullessly manipulating armies and governments to absolutely nobody's benefit and eventually strangling the concept of freedom. That's what Big Boss and Ocelot wanted to stop, because it turns out Ocelot was secretly the Boss's son, her actual legacy. He made it his life's mission to free the world from the Patriots, and to do this, Ocelot had to amass power, leapfrogging over other major villains along the way, destroy the satellite housing the Patriots' programming, and most importantly, let a hero defeat him afterwards so that the world can feel justified in what it's done, and hope can be restored. Like his mother, Ocelot is the villain because he chooses to be, and he helps Snake be the hero that can take him down. What a ride for this character, and Ocelot's a ball to watch every step of the way. His initial gimmick is his attachment to outdated firearms, which turns him into a pretty good Bond villain. He loves to show off by spinning his revolvers around, monologuing before the big showdown, but because he's so quick on the draw, it's not a problem if someone tries to attack him during his speeches. If it wasn't for the grander conspiracies at play, Ocelot would still be memorable as a quirky underling, an eccentric gunslinger who always manages to squirm away just before the plan goes up in smoke, only to appear in the next game beside a new employer. He's got this Team Rocket quality to him, where I can blast him away over and over again and never get tired of it. Look at him hamming it up with this Colt single action. Now look at him failing to spin it with his offhand after Grey Fox cuts off his good arm. That's some seriously hilarious karmic punishment. Except, no. This too is just a ploy to manipulate you. Well, not the losing the arm part, I don't think he initially planned for that, but he's clearly pretending to be more feeble than he is, because as a kid, he was perfectly capable of twirling his weapons with both hands. Everything he does is to simply misdirect the heroes, the other villains, and you, the player. Sure, it's all pretty convoluted, but this is Metal Gear we're talking about. I would be insulted if the main villain was any more straightforward. If this is a series about war, then Metal Gear's stance is that war is convoluted. It's crazy. It's kind of stupid. Everything drags on longer than it should, all the plans have 5 steps too many, and all of the weapons are more extravagant and expensive than they need to be. Did Ocelot need to make his plan so complicated? Probably not. But this whole war-driven society is so extraneous and driven by ego that maybe we needed an extraneous egomaniac to correct it, after which a more sensible man like Snake, weary of war and longing for peace, could put Ocelot down and set things right. If I had to choose my favorite boss fight in the series, well, actually, it would be the boss from MGS3. But close behind is the final showdown between Snake and Ocelot. Ocelot has succeeded. He's tricked Snake into destroying the Patriots. He's liberated the world from its formless existential tyrants. And Ocelot knows he has to pay for the crimes he's committed to get this far. But rather than lie down, he puts up his dukes and boxes with Snake at the top of the world. Because at the end of it all, his final wish is to return to a simpler time when he was dueling Big Boss, Snake's father whom Ocelot admired so much. His last words aren't to curse Snake's name or even praise him for his victory. It's simply,
You're pretty good.
You're pretty good. Pretty good.
the same compliment Big Boss paid him all those years ago. And this gets me every time. War needs to end, and Ocelot is a man defined by war. And so, he ends it on his own terms, by being the final boss. And you know what? I think that's pretty cool.
Did I ever tell you the definition of insanity?
Now here's a series I don't talk about much. Far Cry. Since the third game in the series, Far Cry began a tradition of putting special emphasis on each game's central villain, even centering the market and box art on them. In Far Cry 4, we have the cordial dictator Pagan Min. In Far Cry 5, we have the zealous extremist Joseph Seed. And in Far Cry 6, we have that guy from Breaking Bad. I know he has a name, but Breaking Bad guy. In all three of these games, it feels less like you're playing the hero and more like you're just trying to survive the villain's story. All three of these despots are brought to life with amazing scripts and stellar performances, but I think the one to perfect the formula is still the lunatic who set the trend, Far Cry 3's Vaz Montenegro. And he only had half the game to do it. Vaz is, by trade, a pirate, and not the fun kind with the swords and the peg legs and the poor optometrist coverage. No, Vaz is a pirate of the Rook Islands, who makes his living running a criminal ring in both drugs and human trafficking. Despite that, Vaz is somehow both incredibly fun, but also the last person you want to be at the mercy of. Think of one of the most iconic villains in all of film, Darth Vader. From his first appearance, he was a memorable menace. But if you actually look at the original Star Wars, Vader only has approximately 8 minutes of screen time. This trick can only be done by a villain who takes over every scene he's in, and whose presence is felt even when he's not around. And Vaz nails this. During your time on a northern island, you feel like Vaz could be around any corner. Townsfolk all have stories to tell about his cruelty, and he likes to play peekaboo when you least expect it. That's when the real fun begins. With a chilling performance by Michael Mando, he milks his mere 11 minutes of screen time for all it's worth. You just gotta listen to this guy talk.
Who the fuck is it going to be? Them or me? Me or them? You have a fucking problem in your head. Do you think I'm bullshitting you? Do you think I'm lying? Fuck you! I like this phone. This is a nice fucking phone.
And already this would be enough to warrant a spot on the list, but Vaz is deeper than he looks. At the center of it all, Vaz is a very sad man. He was born into the aggressive Rakyat tribe, manipulated into becoming a killer by his older sister, got addicted to drugs, defected from his tribe to be manipulated by a mustache twirler, and now finds himself chained to a dangerous lifestyle that he both loves and laments. While he holds you captive, he'll shoot the breeze with you, only to swing into a frenzy at the drop of a hat. He's like Dr. Nefarious but played straight, waving a gun in your face with no way of knowing whether he'll pull the trigger or not. You can't help but like him, but when he's on screen, you're just wishing that he would get out of your face. And then, he does the most unpredictable thing he could do. He dies! And there's still half the campaign left! This has become a popular criticism of Far Cry 3, taking out the most popular character and, frankly, best thing about the game so early, though I get what they were going for. Far Cry 3, much like Spec Ops: The Line, is a story about someone trying to be a hero and getting caught up in all the killing. As yuppie rich kid Jason, you slowly rise from wimp to warrior in a mission to save all of your friends who were captured on spring break. But, when it comes time to leave, Jason can't. All of this violence has changed him, and he finds that he's enjoying the bloodshed as much as we the players are. It's the only way he knows how to interact with this world. So if the first half of the game is about you defeating Vaz, the second half is about you becoming him. It almost doesn't matter what villain replaces him. The point of Vaz was to make you empathize with a cold-blooded killer and then turn you into one. And while I think Far Cry 3 does a pretty good job at that trope, not as good as Spec Ops: The Line, mind you, Jason never holds a candle to the pirate who taught him everything he knows. And it looks like Ubisoft felt the same way, because in 2021, Far Cry 6 brought Vaz back in his own DLC campaign, where you play as Vaz. I was a little nervous that they were just cashing in on the nostalgia points and might mess up the character, but I gotta say, I'm really happy with how they explored the character. Insanity Vaz takes place entirely in Vaz's head, giving us a glimpse of his twisted perception of reality, and it's a nightmare. More importantly, it's another chance for Mondo to own this character. The same actor in the same legendary role, it would be insane to expect a different result. Which reminds me.
Did I ever tell you the definition of insanity?
Ganondorf. What more is there left to say about Ganondorf? A lot, actually. In fact, Comic and I have been planning a collab video all about the Demon King for, well, damn years now. I guess we've been too busy with these countdowns, life, thesaurus shopping. But even if that video were 2 hours long, there would still be more to say about the Great Gerudo Chief. So we can certainly spare a few paltry paragraphs. And to be honest, this one is very personal to me. He's the nemesis to my favorite hero in my favorite franchise. For most of my life, I felt like Ganondorf's been my nemesis. I can't be objective on this one. I love and hate this man with a passion. But for long-standing video game franchises, especially in the Nintendo catalog, no villain has survived as the focal point of the series for so long, while still being taken very seriously. To put it simply, take everything I said about Link as the perfect video game hero and apply it to villainy. Ganon had to adapt through the ages of video games depending on what was expected in gaming at the time. He went from a simple monster in a dungeon holding a captive princess to a devious sorcerer capable of pulling a mid-game plot twist. So many games that seem to go in a different direction find themselves being hijacked by Ganon. The trope was named after him for a reason. I know some fans don't like this, especially when it pushes aside fascinating fiends like Girhim or Zant, but to me, the sense of danger always rises when the Warlock makes his return. One consistency is his nigh invulnerability. Most of the time you can't even scratch this guy without embarking on a quest for the Master Sword, which is great for a game whose job is to send you on quests. As video game stories got more complex, so did Ganon. Throughout the series' timeline, which uniquely expands in all directions, the Pig Beast was eventually given the backstory of being chieftain of a clan of thieves named Ganondorf Dragmire. He was trained in the ways of magic by the twin witches who raised him, and he grew up to dupe the King of Hyrule into opening his gates, all for a chance at the golden power of the Triforce. In Wind Waker, this story was recontextualized with unexpected pathos, that perhaps Ganondorf only coveted this power so he could provide for his people who were doomed to suffer in the desert. Going by the barren grounds of the Gerudo Desert in Twilight Princess, maybe he was right to preemptively strike Hyrule. They were not kind to his people. Where Wind Waker gives us a sad, introspective Ganondorf who clings to his failure, Twilight Princess gives us a Ganondorf consumed by malice, an unstoppable warlord who simply refuses to die until his vengeance burns away all of society. This certainly brings new light to the various handheld and retro games, where Ganon's trapped in a monstrous form befitting his twisted desires, and in Breath of the Wild, we see the anger and malevolence truly consume him until nothing of the man remains in the living maelstrom that is Calamity Ganon. I've spent untold hours thinking about Ganondorf's agency in all this. In his fighting back against the goddesses who have decided his fate is to either rot with his people in the desert, or to lose repeatedly over the span of multiple timelines. And of Demise, the original demon from Skyward Sword that swore revenge on Link and Zelda and manifests that revenge through Ganondorf. Did Ganondorf ever have any choice in these actions? Was it his will to defy fate that attracted Demise to act through him? Or was it always demise guiding his actions, and he never had any choice at all, like a scripted enemy in a video game? It blows my mind to think that while almost every game in the series features a new reincarnation of Link and Zelda centuries apart, Ganondorf is, with only one exception, always the same man from Ocarina of Time, back from the dead or from astral prison by whatever magic or plot device he could get his hands on. So if you consider these Links and Zeldas to be different people filling the same role, Ganondorf is actually the character to appear in most Zelda games. It's him and his actions around which the series revolves, the reason why new heroes need to be born. And just as I said of Link last time, Ganondorf exhibits the talents of all three pieces of the Triforce. Wisdom? Well, he politically maneuvered himself around the King of Hyrule, backstabbed many would-be final bosses, and caught the Golden Duo in his traps on multiple occasions. And courage? This guy looked down at his executioners and laughed in their faces, taking one of them down with him. The Triforce of Power is what was drawn to him when the Triforce broke, only because it's the trait he most values. It's the piece his tainted hand would naturally reach for first. All of these talents are displayed in his plethora of memorable boss fights. He can cast spells better than Zelda, he's as good with swords as Link, and he can rage like no other. And no, not bringing up the fishing pole trick, that was an Easter egg and I'm not honoring it here. If this was a favorite villains list, well, bam, here's my favorite. While a lot of my feelings are based on personal interpretations rather than concrete text from the games, I still think Ganondorf could have topped this list. But even if I have to force myself to put him only at number 2, his power and influence is still undeniable. Nothing's changed! When I made my original top 10 heroes and villains lists, I went in knowing my number 1 picks. Link was always special to me, and Kefka was kind of a pillar of the old Countdown community. There were things that we all just agreed to back then. Shadow of the Colossus was an artistic masterpiece, Jasper Bad Jr. was a crime against humanity, and Kefka was the all-time greatest villain. That was the standard, the null hypothesis. I wanted to remaster these old lists to see how much I'd grown as a video maker. And this time, I didn't have my choices pre-picked. I listed them all out and weighed their pros and cons. Link managed to stay on top, which I'm happy about, he is special to me. But Kefka, basically the symbol of a bygone era of cringe countdowns and uncontested conclusions. All this list has shown me is that in these 10 years, I'm in the exact same place I started. Well, you came for a video, so I'd better finish it. For this last segment, how about instead of just repeating the same points from a decade ago, let me take this opportunity to talk about the community for a bit. To start, I didn't actually grow up with Final Fantasy VI. I didn't play it until the GBA port when I was in high school, and by that time, I'd already had the story summarized for me. How it was such a big twist halfway through when the villain actually won, how Kefka's turn from comedy side villain to main baddie was mind-blowing, how the devastation of his victory led to heart-wrenching scene after heart-wrenching scene, and how his final boss battle was a work of symbolic brilliance because it looks like a Michelangelo sculpture and sounds like a fugue by Bach. And I loved it all because, well, people I really liked online loved it, and they told me to love it. That's really what this YouTube thing was for us. We can't possibly consume every game out there, so we found content creators we liked who'd seen what we hadn't, and we formed our opinions around theirs. If you happen to finally play the thing on your own, you either validated the opinion you already had, or the game became overrated to you, and you were compelled to post your unpopular opinion. And it was nice for a while. There were a lot of us Countdown artists, and even though we didn't all agree, we'd formed this kind of shared shorthand of what was good and what was bad. Things were simple back then. If the media landscape was the quiet world of Final Fantasy VI, our stupid internet community was like espers bringing their magic into the world. But it couldn't stay that way forever. Everything cited to make Kefka a great villain is still true today. He's got that rags to riches story, an unassuming Magitech experiment who overthrew the Empire. He's hilariously cruel, spouting quotable quips at every turn and demanding his peons wipe sand off his boot while he's walking through a desert. That always got me. And he is sadistically ruthless. My jaw dropped when he poisoned Doma's water supply. But I think what really drew the young list makers to him in the 20-teens was his sense of nihilism. Kefka wants nothing. He stands for nothing. He attains ultimate power and does nothing with it, merely sitting atop his tower and occasionally polishing a city off the globe on a whim. When you confront him, he doesn't seem particularly happy with his throne, just cynical. Like any sign of progress or personal meaning in the world annoys him. It's ironic that he dresses like a clown because although he's made us laugh, his final endgame was for no one to feel anything. And I think as budding writers emulating the angry video game nerd and a nostalgia critic, there was something simultaneously terrifying and enticing about that mindset. It's what we rebelled against by ascribing random rankings to our favorite games in some hope that the numerics would give them some sense of greater meaning. But it also gave us that cynicism to tear down what was previously considered the best. Like, I guess we'd heard too much about Final Fantasy VII redefining the genre, because suddenly it was the most overrated game in history. Cloud and Sephiroth were just edgelords, and Aerith's death was overplayed. 6 was the true masterpiece. We proved it, with our facts and our rankings. But the years go by, and it turns out Kefka's nihilism isn't so easy to extinguish. It just moves. Now I get comments on these old videos about how Final Fantasy VI is overrated, and everyone's tired of seeing Kefka. Mention the Chaos Theater, reference Katana Bait, and you'll get mixed reactions. At best remembered fondly, but more often with a mountain of cringe, especially from the people who made those videos. It's what got us where we are, but where even is that? To address some of the complaints against Final Fantasy VI, the story isn't as deep in in-character work as we might have led you to believe. There are a lot of heroes that each get a great moment or two, but each arc is very sporadic, summarized in a scene and probably never seen again. And I think that's because there's no central protagonist in Final Fantasy VI. It's kind of Terra, but kind of Locke, but kind of Celes. But more than anything, it's Kefka's game. He's the central character, an evil so massive that it takes a small army of protagonists to overcome him. Final Fantasy VI is about the world contending with a horrifying change, and battling against a massive void of meaningless. Celes comes to the brink of choosing death over continued existence, but finds the strength to seek out her friends. Locke, a lowly thief, strives every day to be a hero despite the harm he's done in the past. And Terra, who like Kefka has otherworldly Esper powers and has known life only as a weapon of war, is able to find peaceful meaning in a humble family of refugees and decides that tiny existence is worth fighting for. I think that pursuit to matter, to mean something, was something I wanted back in 2011. It made me want to take down this clown and assert that both I and my stupid gaming hobby had purpose. And I think after becoming a G-list internet celebrity, with tens of thousands of people writing to me every day, I forgot that feeling. Now, having been through some tough times in the past few years, with the world at its darkest, I think I need this reminder of why I do this. I think I need to beat up that clown in the sky again. And I don't think there's been a single villain in video game history that gave me that feeling quite the same way that Kefka did. And the final point, the name Kefka comes from Franz Kafka, who wrote of people being small and insignificant. And that's exactly what Kefka does as a villain. He asserts himself a god and claims that not only can't you stop him, it would mean nothing if you did. You're just too small. That's why this game doesn't have a Cloud or a Cecil or some other monolithic hero to stand against him. It has a vanguard of smaller heroes who take him down by being who they are and doing what they love. And that's what we are. Every single one of us. We are the airship gamblers, the jungle children, the yetis and the mimes who make up this weird random world, and together, through sharing our experiences, we find a way to matter. Kefka says we don't, but as I've said time and time again, never trust the clown. I'm the Green Scorpion, and thank you for plunging through this darkness with me and shining the spotlight on it. From the goofy to the terrifying to the terrifyingly goofy, video games just would not be the same without these overlords to overthrow. As for next time, hope you brought a swimsuit.